We are resuming the gospel account of Mark. If you got a Bible, make sure you got it open to Mark chapter 2, starting with verse 23. Let me give you a little summary of what's happened so far. We were, at the beginning of this year, we walked through 10 weeks through almost the entire first two chapters of the gospel account. But what we have here with Mark's gospel is the very first gospel account that was written down. So this is eyewitness testimony that Mark gathered. Likely, most historians will say, likely he gathered all of this eyewitness stuff from the apostle Peter. So Peter was one of the apostles that was closest to Jesus. It's kind of in his little inner circle of Peter, James, and John, the three that were closer to him. We see Peter more than any other apostle in the Gospels, right? Everybody knows Peter. He's hard-headed. He says things that every one of us go, "Oh, not again, Peter. You dunce." Peter always does silly things, but Mark, this guy, was actually a companion of Peter later in his journeys, and church history tells us that Mark listened to what Peter had said and basically wrote down all of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus. So we can trust Mark. It was written about 52 AD, so it was written less than 20 years after Jesus came, lived, died, and arose. So when Mark wrote this, there were plenty of people who were still alive who were eyewitnesses of Jesus. And if what Mark wrote and then started distributing to people, if it was false, if he made up stuff, it would have just very quickly gone away. You know, you can start making up lies about stuff that happened 20 years ago, and there are so many people that were alive at that time, you will be discredited immediately because they go, that did not happen. That was not going on in America at that time. I was alive. Maybe you can dupe some of these people who are like 10, 15 years old, but we were alive and we know what happened. So Mark writes about 20 years after Jesus, and it holds up all throughout history, despite a lot of attacks against the gospel accounts trying to say they're not actual eyewitness accounts, they're myths, they're fables, but it's held up, and here we are 2,000 years later because it can't be refuted that actually what we have here in this book is honest eyewitness account of who Jesus is and what Jesus did in his 3 years of ministry while he was on the earth. So Jesus lived to be about 33 years old. When he was 30, he began his public ministry. So the first 30 years of his life, he's a carpenter. He's living with his parents and just an average guy. And then he comes forth and he starts his public ministry. And we're just a short time after his ministry had started here in Mark chapter 2. And what we have is Jesus having another run in with the religious leaders of his day. If you know your Bible a little bit, if you grew up in church at all, you know who the Pharisees are, or you at least know that the Pharisees didn't like Jesus, or that Jesus often got angry at the Pharisees and called them out. So what we have here is something that we're going to have to do a little bit of explaining so we understand the context of why this is such a big deal to these guys, because we aren't Jewish and we don't observe the Sabbath, like Old Testament command to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. So some of this can be lost on us unless we understand why these guys are so upset and why Jesus gets angry at them and all that. So there are two things I want to point you to in this text: the unrest of religion, and the deep rest of Jesus. The unrest of religion and the deep rest of Jesus. So start with me in verse 23. Mark records that one Sabbath, that's a Saturday, that's Jesus, that's who he's talking about, was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, probably going to a synagogue, going to gather with the people of God to receive preaching and to worship, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So the Sabbath is Saturday. It was a day that God had commanded his people to not work. It was a day he commanded, he blessed them and said, on this seventh day of the week, I created everything, and on the seventh day I rested. And so on the seventh day of the week, I want you to rest and you do not do any work. And so that's the command. Don't work. Take a day off. It's good for you physically and spiritually. And what the Pharisees had done is not just look at that command of God and say, okay, good, we want to obey the Sabbath. They said, okay, we need to really make sure we're obeying the Sabbath. So they added 39 extra biblical rules to obey the Sabbath and keep it holy that they imposed on everyone else. And they said, okay, God says don't work. We're going to clarify what it means not to work. So one of the rules was you couldn't walk more than 200 cubits in the day. So, I mean, this is pretty short. This is like a mile maybe. You couldn't walk more than that in one day. You go, what? You can't walk more than a mile? That no, because they go, no. That constitutes work. He said you can't travel more than X amount of kilometers unless it's over water. You go, okay. So one of the things they had also added is if you were walking through a grain field, you couldn't get any grain off of it and eat it. They're like, no, that's working. Like the whole point of the Sabbath was that people would rest. And what the Pharisees do is say, all right, we need to make sure these people really rest. And so we're going to create all of these extra biblical rules. And they basically just they made it something that it's not. And do you notice how crazy the Pharisees are right here? I mean, this is eyewitness account stuff. This isn't like just a story that's teaching us a moral lesson. Read it. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field on their way to church, and the Pharisees are out there following them. This is equivalent to me on a Sunday morning getting in my car and going and driving to your houses and trying to look in your window and be like, hey, why aren't you at church? I mean, there's probably more biblical warrant for me being crazy and going to your house and saying, why aren't you at church? There's a command in the scripture. It says, don't neglect the gathering of the body. Don't neglect the gathering of the church. Don't forsake that. It's like, so maybe I wouldn't be quite as crazy as these Pharisees who are adding to the Bible and then trying to make sure that everyone else obeys their rules. So he said to them, why do they not do what's lawful on the Sabbath? Notice they say, because our extra biblical rules say that you're breaking this law, do not work on the Sabbath. Why are you doing what's not lawful? Jesus doesn't even, he basically just takes a step back and doesn't answer the direct question, but he tries to get to the heart of what's really going on with them. He doesn't just say, you guys are nuts. It's not unlawful to grab something in your hand and just put it in your mouth out of somebody's field. Like, they're not working, they're hungry. He doesn't even go there because Jesus, in his infinite wisdom and his infinite grace, he always just goes straight for the heart of the issue. I love that about Jesus. As you read through the Gospels, they ask him questions, and he never just goes, well, it's not lawful, or it's not unlawful, and they just go, oh, okay. He always knows there's something deeper going on here, and let's get to that. He said to them, verse 25, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? And those who were with him, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God, that was the tabernacle, in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. So what he does is he points to an Old Testament passage found in 1 Samuel when David, this great King David, who these Jewish Pharisees, they loved David, said, do you remember what David did when he was in need and he was hungry? They went into the tabernacle and ate the bread. For all intents and purposes, it would be like people coming in here and they're really hungry and they come and take all of the Lord's Supper bread. It's like, whoa, that's for the Lord's Supper. That's not just for like Joe is hungry and we, just go and have all the bread. Jesus is saying David shouldn't have done that, but he and his friends were in need. And so they got to go into the tabernacle. And because they were hungry, because they were starving, they were able to eat the bread of the presence. Like, haven't you even read what that is? It's like, and so my disciples who are hungry and are eating these heads of grain, do you not see how these even could connect? That need really outweighs some of the commands are like, it's not to be rigid and a curse to you, it's to be a blessing to you. He's saying, well, David even did that, and he's really just challenging them to think through this deeper. And he says in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, speaking of himself, is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus reminds these crazy religious guys that even David did something he wasn't supposed to do when there was need, but then he really gets to two deeper levels. Jesus says, man was not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. He's saying the reason you exist is not so that you can obey the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given to you as a gift. You see the difference? Like, you weren't created to obey Sabbath. The Sabbath was created to serve you and to be a blessing to you. So he says, you don't even understand the point of the Sabbath. You're making it a burden on people rather than the blessing that it's intended to be. And then he even goes a level deeper and says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. It was God himself who gave the Sabbath, this seventh day of rest, to the people in Israel. And Jesus makes this claim, and don't miss what he's doing. Jesus is claiming to be divine. When Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, I'm the one who gives the Sabbath. I'm the Lord over all humanity and all creation. I'm the king of the Sabbath. You're trying to take a blessing that I've given and make it a burden. Said, but I'm the Lord of it. It's a shocking claim, and we'll come back to it in a minute. And so then again, we have another scene. Again, he entered the synagogue. So maybe this is the next week, or maybe this is later that same day. And a man was there with a withered hand. Don't exactly know what that means. He had a strong hand of some sorts. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, so he turns to the Pharisees, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. The Sabbath was about rest, about restoring the broken, about bringing healing to the hurting. The Sabbath is really about everything that this guy with the withered hand, it's really deeply about everything this guy needs. He needs restoration. He needs healing. These Pharisees are so concerned that their traditions, that their extra biblical rules that they hold so closely, they're so concerned with those being obeyed, they don't even want Jesus to heal the guy. Or maybe you could say in another way, they did want Jesus to heal the guy, but not for the good of the man with the withered hand, but so that they could finally accuse and get rid of Jesus. Their hearts are really as withered as this man's hand. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. It's funny that Jesus does no work on the Sabbath. He doesn't actually break any of the laws, right? He's not working. They think him healing someone is work. They're so blinded by their religion, blinded by trying to be good enough and obey all of these rules, that they don't even want something to happen that's really what the Sabbath is all about, bringing restoration. They don't want this man to be healed. They just want to make sure everyone obeys the rules correctly, especially their rules. Jesus just says, I love this. He says, come here. Jesus doesn't do anything. He's just standing there. Come here. The guy walks over there, not more than 200 cubits, says, stretch out your hand. I mean, is this work? Stretches out his hand, and immediately, and notice the Pharisees, they wanted to trap Jesus because he's healing this guy, but notice they don't even try to trap him, because all Jesus does is say, stretch out your hand. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm? And they were silent because they had nothing to say back to him. Then immediately after this, they went out and sought counsel with these guys named the Herodians of how to destroy Jesus. So really the questions we've got to ask is, why are these Pharisees such tools? I mean, if you're not thinking that question, you're like, this guy, Jesus has been healing people and is bringing the kingdom of God to bear on this world, showing what it's like when he comes to reverse the curse that sin has reaped on this world, and these guys don't even want someone to be healed. I mean, I understand if it's like, hey, we have a rule against plucking grain with your hands. You probably shouldn't do that because I think it's work. It's like, okay, you guys you're just annoying. You're annoying. And then the next Sabbath, the guy that needs healing, they're like, oh, you better not heal that guy. I mean, are any of us going, these guys are out of their minds? But then the other question we have to ask is, why did Jesus get so mad at them? I mean, do you see in the passage it says Jesus was angry at them. It doesn't mean Jesus was just like, oh my gosh. Jesus is ticked. He's grieved. So why are these guys such jerks? And why is Jesus so angry at them? And the answer is, in a word, religion. The reason these guys are acting like this is because their worth and their identity, their status, is not coming from God and His grace, but it's coming through how well they can obey. So the answer to what Jesus gets ticked at and why these guys are mad at him is because they hold a traditional religious view. Religion basically operates under various forms of this same one principle. If I obey, if I perform, then I'm accepted. So obedience precedes acceptance with God or with a law or with your higher power or whatever it may be. That's the just traditional religion that basically all of them are the same. C.S. Lewis, probably one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, which is top 100 book written in the 20th century as well on many lists. But at the end of this book, Lewis basically lists, it's kind of footnotes at the end. He lists all the major world religions and basically shows how all of them are saying pretty much the exact same thing. They're saying, basically simplified, if you are good enough, if you obey, if you uphold your end, then you will know in the end that you are accepted by God or the higher power of the universe or whatever you import there. That's the traditional religious view, and that's exactly what these Pharisees are holding. They looked to the law of God and they sought to justify themselves to basically make it, if they were good enough, then God would essentially be forced to accept them because they had obeyed all the rules so well. And when you do that, notice what the Pharisees did. This is exactly what everyone else does. When you're trying to establish your own worth through your works, through your religious code or morals, you don't just look at the law and say, okay, do that. You look at the law and say, okay, I need it to be more specific. So I'm going to add all these other rules on top of the law to make sure that I definitely obey the law. So you don't just look at the law and say, obey the law. They look at, don't work on the Sabbath, and they say, okay, 39 more rules to make sure that we really obey the Sabbath. And what you'll do then is not just add more rules to the former rules, you will make sure everyone else needs to obey them too. And you'll point your finger at them, you'll lift up your nose at them if they don't obey the rules like you think they should. And it really just creates undeniable unrest. Religion creates unrest because you're always having to perform. You're always having to be good enough. I mean, look at these Pharisees. They're so upset that his disciples are plucking grains because they're like, no, no, no. That is not what you do to obey the Sabbath. You do not heal a man on the Sabbath. They're more concerned with their rules because it's not just like, oh, this is right and this is what we should do. They're seeking to justify themselves through their own obedience and through their own performance for God. The truth is, trying to achieve your own worth, your own value through your works, through what you do, or through who you are, it's like being on an endless treadmill of performance. You're never going anywhere. It doesn't matter what religious code or morals or ethics, or even if it's not morals and it's just free thinking and I'll create my own path. Whatever you're doing, if it's dependent on you, who you are, or what you do, you are on an endless treadmill. How many of you feel like sometimes you're on a treadmill in life? You're trying, you're trying, you're trying, you're not going anywhere, you're not going anywhere. And friends, that's what religion gets you. Religion causes unrest for the person trying to perform because you're just running. It also causes unrest most times for those who are surrounded by the person trying to perform. Look at the Pharisees. They're on that treadmill, got to keep obeying, got to keep doing enough so then God accepts me. And it's even bleeding out and going to other people. Jesus' disciples can't eat breakfast because these guys are running on their treadmill. This man with a withered hand, he can't get a healing if the Pharisees have it up to them because they're running, 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 running. They don't have rest. The people around them don't have rest. I mean, modern times, look at what's happening in Syria right now. If you don't know what's going on, you need to open up some websites, go check out the news, see what's going on in Syria. People are dying because they're fleeing Syria because of a war that's going on in their country with ISIS and with many other parties. It's getting crazy there. So all of these people are trying to flee to Europe, and many of them are dying trying to get there. Just the other day on the news, they show this image that 2 to 3 year old boy washes up on the shore in Europe and it drowned as he and his family are just trying to escape their war-torn country. Why is all that happening in Syria? Religion. Because of Islam is dominating that, and people are fighting one another over who's right and who's wrong and who should be in power. And the basis of Islam is the 5 pillars of faith, and if you do those well, then God accepts you. And then you have radical Islam that says you have to kill all of the infidels, you have to kill all of those who oppose Islam. And so because in the end, whether or not they're going to be acceptable to their God, Allah, is whether or not they are good enough, whether or not they are serious enough, whether or not they perform like the extremists, whether or not they perform jihad well enough. The whole country is in turmoil because of this, and people are dying, and just doesn't just create unrest for the person trying to perform. Most of the time, it causes everyone else around you to be in that storm of unrest. That's traditional religion. And so some of us go, you see, that's why religious people are so nuts. They go, I agree. I mean, you probably have a lot of friends that go, religious people are out of their minds. They're just trying to perform. They're just trying to do something so that their divine genie will give them blessings. But really, even in this passage, we see that it's not only those of traditional religion that are confronted with the gospel and who get mad at the gospel and who get upset at Jesus. It's also those with untraditional religion. I mean, it's interesting to look at the very end of the passage. Did you see the Pharisees go out and they held counsel with the Herodians to see how they could destroy Jesus? So the Herodians are not religious in the typical sense of the word, in the traditional religious sense. They're not Jewish. They were Romans, and they were followers of Herod, who were probably the most evil little kings of these regions that Israel ever had. They believed in Greek philosophy, Greek morals, so sleep around, prostitutes all the time, go in your temples and worship whatever god you want. They were very amoral. They just didn't care. They were very political. They were the political powers of the day. Basically, in every way, they were opposite of the Pharisees. The Pharisees are trying very hard to obey the law of God so that they know they have worth. The Herodians are trying very hard to not obey the law of God, to carve their own path, to have their own morals. They would say things like, what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. The intolerant people are out, the tolerant people are in. It's the same thing. You're still going, you need to convert to what I'm doing and the way I'm thinking, and when you do that, then you'll know you're accepted. People of like untraditional religion, meaning relativists, atheists, people that just think truth is just, we can't really define truth. What's true for you is true for you. It's funny that they really a lot of times don't like traditional religious people, and they think we're traditionally religious trying to perform and make God love us, and they say that's so ridiculous. You guys are so small-minded. Said if you really want to know You're in the right. You need to become like me. You need to think like me. And say, stop trying to convert us to Christianity. It's like, well, you're trying to convert us to relativism. But can't we just try to convert one another? The truth is, it doesn't matter who or what you're looking to for your worth. If it's you, if it has anything to do with your performance, if it has anything to do with who you are or what you can do, you're on the treadmill. The good news of the gospel is that it is neither religion in the traditional sense or irreligion. It's neither carve your own path, be completely tolerant of everyone, and it's neither obey and be good enough so that God will love you. The good news of what Jesus came and purchased for us is something totally different than either of those. It's called the gospel. If you're on that treadmill, you're never going to have rest in yourself. If you're looking to yourself, it doesn't matter how. If you're looking to yourself, your family, your job, your bank account, your whatever, you're on the treadmill. You're going nowhere. You're never going to have that deep rest that you long for, but there's good news because there's deep rest found in Jesus. You notice in this verse that we mentioned earlier, verse 28, Jesus says, so the Son of Man, that's his favorite title for himself, taken from the book of Daniel. It's this God, but he looks like a man character who will come and establish a kingdom that will never end. So when Jesus says he's the Son of Man, he's both claiming to be divine and to be human at the same time. And he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So what's the real point of the Sabbath? It's not just rest. It's not just that simple. See, if you go all the way back to the book of Exodus, you'll see that God's people, the Israelites, were enslaved in a land called Egypt under an evil king, Pharaoh. So they greatly multiply in Egypt, and then Pharaoh makes them slaves, and he makes them work all day, every day, making bricks. Bricks, 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 bricks. Their identity and their worth while they were in Egypt was determined by how many bricks they made. If you didn't do good enough, if you broke your leg, they just kill you. You're no use to it. You make bricks, and that's what you do. So after they had been there for hundreds of years, God delivers his people. If you remember, like this whole crazy story, God sends Moses to say, Pharaoh, bro, let my people go. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go. Anyone? Anyone around in the 90s? Pharaoh says, no. So God sends a succession of 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, the final being that the firstborn son of every family in Egypt would die. Pharaoh finally lets God's people go. God delivers them, and a lot of crazy stuff happens. God delivers them. I mean, did the Israelites do anything to get delivered from Egypt? They just walked. They didn't even know where they were going. God was a pillar of fire and smoke. He was a cloud going before them, and he said, hey, follow this big cloud. They're like, okay. They didn't even know where they're going. They did nothing. God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. He delivered them by grace. Then he gives them the commandments, the law, and then they set out to go towards Canaan, the promised land, which is where Jerusalem is in Israel. Okay? So then God gives them the Sabbath after he delivers them from Egypt by grace. Here's the crazy thing. God says, on the seventh day, do not work. And if you don't understand what he's doing, it looks like, well, crap. God's like rigid with everything, even when we don't work. Here's the point of the Sabbath. God said, there will be one day, I know you were in Egypt. You worked every day, all day. Your worth was tied to how many bricks you made. And he says in Deuteronomy 31 that the Sabbath is not just some silly command. The Sabbath is about you taking one day a week to remember that you're not in Egypt anymore. I'm not Pharaoh. You're not just valuable to me through what you produce. You're valuable to me because I chose to love you. He said, this is a reminder that you don't have to look to your performance to get your worth. It says, I'm the one who delivered you. Take the Sabbath day to refocus on me and remember, it doesn't matter if my work's not done throughout the week. On Saturday, I can rest because God's the one who saves. There's really even a deeper level of Sabbath in the scripture. If you remember the act of creation, God creates everything in 6 days, and then on the seventh day, he rests. Any of you ever go, what? Is God tired? Of course not. So why did God rest on the seventh day? Why did he have that first Sabbath? And really, it's because there's a rest that's deeper than just physical rest. That seventh day rest God took on creation is the rest that's so deep. It's the kind of rest that you can go, it doesn't matter what's going on. I can look at my work and say, it is finished. That deep rest of it's finished. I can put it away. I can stop. My identity, my value doesn't come from what I do. It comes from God and his grace. That's the kind of rest that Jesus offers you in the gospel. When Jesus says he's Lord of the Sabbath, he's not just saying, I'm Lord over it, I can control it, I'm the one who gave it. Jesus is really speaking to our hearts and look at me. What Jesus is saying to you in Mark chapter 2, when he says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, I'm the Lord of your rest. I'm your rest. I'm the rest you're longing for. That deep rest that we all need, that kind of REM sleep, but spiritually. You can take all the naps in the world, you can rest all you want, but doctors will tell you if you don't get deep sleep, you're going to run dry. What Jesus comes to offer you is not just a nap. Jesus comes to offer you that deep REM rest, that you can rest in what he's done for you. Just like the Israelites rested in what God had done to deliver them from Egypt, Jesus is saying, what I'm going to do when I go to the cross, it's going to make it to where you can rest. So how can we have that deep rest? Well, it's the cross. The way that you and I can know that we have value, we have worth, that God accepts us is not going to be found looking to yourself. If you keep looking to yourself, you're going to die. If you keep looking to yourself, you're going to be like Narcissus, just continually looking into the pool, looking at your own reflection. Nothing will ever change. Nothing will ever happen. Oh, but if you look to Jesus, and you see that on the cross, it's the pinnacle of his obedience for you. He obeyed God in every way, obeyed the law, perfectly righteous, so that when your faith is in him, you could be counted righteous before God. Then on the cross, Jesus died for our sins. He died for that very reason that we have unrest. This undeniable unrest that every human being experiences. The reason we want vacations so bad is because we long for that deep inner rest that we know I'm okay. I'm accepted. I'm loved. I don't have to perform. The reason we desire that is because we're supposed to have it. But our sin alienated us from God. Adam and Eve had that kind of rest, walking in the presence of God. And they sinned, and we've been sinning ever since. But on the cross, Jesus takes all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our guilt, and he died for it. So that if your faith is in him, you can have that rest. Here's the good news of the gospel. At the end of God's great act of creation, he said, it is finished. It's done, and he could rest. At the end of Jesus' great act of redemption, he said, it is finished, and you can rest. This bucks up against everything in our culture. This is the hardest thing, is looking not to yourself. I mean, if you think about some famous songs that are right now, I'll close with this. I do wedding photography and videography, so I was at one yesterday. A couple of you guys were there. A song that I hear more than anything nowadays. You want to guess what it is? Watch me whip. No, watch me nay nay. Okay, that's the song that's on like every wedding I do. Can you imagine having that conversation with someone and saying the words to that song? these songs, there's a plethora. This is just one example. The song says, "Watch me whip," talking about his car. "Watch me nay nay." "Watch me whip whip." No, "Watch me nay nay." And then the pre-chorus gets really creative. "Watch me, watch me, watch me, watch me." He just keeps saying, "Watch me." Like, if is this not the song of our generation? Me, me, me. The problem is many of us aren't just telling other people to watch us, but we're telling ourselves, "Watch me, watch me, watch me. Am I doing good enough? Am I obeying well enough? Am I open-minded enough? Am I being tolerant enough?" Friends, Jesus says, "Watch me living for your righteousness. Watch me bleeding for you on the cross. Watch me resurrecting from death to life. Watch me and find the rest that you're longing for." Don't watch yourself. Don't call others to watch you. Call others to watch Jesus. And you yourself, look to him. He's the rest that you're longing for. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. Until you see and trust that what Jesus has done in his life, death, and resurrection makes you loved, makes you acceptable, makes you righteous before God, you will never have rest. But if you do look to Jesus, if you watch him, even when you're physically exerting yourself, even amidst the busiest weeks that you've ever had, you'll be able to inwardly be resting because Jesus said it is finished. Pray with me. Father God, I thank you for your grace. I thank you for your scripture. Thank you so much for giving us the Bible so that we don't have to try to determine what truth is. Thank you for revealing your truth to us. Now, we ask you to help us see the unrest of religion. We ask you to help us see the evil that it is to try to make ourselves good enough for you. Help us to see that you don't accept the currency of our good works. You only accept the currency of Christ's work for us. Help us to not watch me or watch anyone else. Help us to watch Jesus and find that deep rest. And from that deep rest, Lord, help us to then be working for your glory and for others' joy, but all the time resting in Jesus' finished work. It's in his name we pray.